The best way to tell as a founder of whether or not you're sitting on that border of delusion and ambition is whether or not your customers actually want what you're doing.
What's maybe one cultural aspect of DoorDash that was present from the super early days?
I think the name of the game is to understand what is it that we're actually doing for the customer. It's almost like if you can run your business with metrics that only a customer would care about. Customer doesn't care about how many users you have, or how much revenue you generate, or whatever your ARR is.
Do you worry that there is a more AI native version of DoorDash out there? All right, folks, welcome to SPC. Welcome, Tony, to SPC.
Thank you.
All right, we have a short hour here, so I'm not going to take a lot of time to introduce Tony. I think he's pretty well known at this stage. So I'm going to jump right in. Did you know that you wanted to be a founder? Like, how could you have, what were your earliest almost like inklings of wanting to be a builder, a creator?
I don't know if there were inklings of my becoming a founder, because I thought I was going to become an academic. So my parents brought me to the US when I was very young, when I was 4. And, our family, I didn't know what this meant at the time, but our family came to the country with $250 in the bank. As a result of that, I had to earn all of my toys. So one example that comes to mind, maybe my first company, I didn't think of it this way until you asked the question, was a lawn mowing business when I was 7 or 8. I was barely tall enough. I don't know if anyone has mowed lawns, but acres of grass, not like the San Francisco yards we're talking about. And the reason why I did that was because I really wanted to buy Nintendo and Duck Hunt. And so I don't know if that's called tinkering per se. That was probably the first quote unquote entrepreneurial experience. Something else that comes to mind for whatever reason when you ask that question is I had to move around a lot as a kid. My parents were always trying to find a better lot in life for our family. And for me, that meant trying to find a better school. So I probably went to 4 schools in my first, 6 years of elementary school, maybe 7 years, something like that. So I was always kind of the new kid who had to figure out a new teacher system, a new friend network, a new logistics setup, etc. And so I was always very good at figuring out the new thing. Those are probably the best examples I can think of that maybe were somewhat useful to me later on in life, where you kind of have to figure it out. If I were to summarize those stories, it was figure it out on how you want to buy your own Nintendo and video games, figure it out on how you're going to make it in school. But I had a very free childhood.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So actually some similarities there. So I also moved around a lot growing up. And I actually probably attended about 10 or 11 different schools all through high school.
Wow.
And I think one of the things that makes you kind of moving around a bunch and always being the new person is be really adaptable, be really flexible, and you kind of figure out how to fit in. And it kind of makes sense, right, that you're very comfortable with the fast rate of change in Silicon Valley. So here's kind of the way to morph this question. I think that sometimes it's only obvious when you connect the dots backwards, as Steve Jobs said, right? What your life ends up becoming. So to jump around a bit here, what do you think the first 10 years of DoorDash, as you kind of now look back, and it's kind of amazing to hear you talk both about the journey so far,
sure,
but also what's coming. What do you think it uniquely positions DoorDash to do in the AI world that we're kind of going towards, right?
Yeah.
What are the set of skills? What are the set of almost happenstances that have happened that allow, what can DoorDash become?
I feel like right now, and maybe I had this thought in 2021 or 22, that this decade, you're going to have 2 big battles in business. And they're almost you can call them battles, you can call them wars, you can call them explorations. There's a handful of companies that are fighting for your attention. They want to be the super assistant that can, solve any query that you may have, or later on any task that you may have. And that's not the world in which DoorDash lives. DoorDash lives in the second world, which is we are trying to facilitate all of the physical atoms, not the digital bits, in the world, to actually make something useful that hopefully will complement actually what's happening in the race for your attention, because the two kind of, systems kind of need to work together if you think about it. No app ecosystem or operating system is that useful if it can't really solve everyday problems for you, I would argue. It's why you find probably the device in your pocket to be the most valuable or most used device you may carry or have. And it's not just because it solves lots of fun digital problems in the background for you, but it can do things in the physical world for you. And so when I think about the physical world that, probably certainly isn't getting the amount of attention as the digital world, there's lots of exciting things happening. For example, if you think about the amount of things or stuff that people look for or buy today or could buy today, there's tens of millions of those items today. On DoorDash, however, there's only one of them, 1 million of those items. That means we can solve 5% of your needs, expressed, through searches, expressed through things you've actually bought, expressed through things that sit on shelves but are not digitized in any way, shape, or form. Bring everything inside the city to you, I think, is the best way to grow the GDP of those cities and do something productive for your life. And hopefully, team up with all these, people trying to compete to be your digital assistant. I think that's a really big, mission in what we can do. We can talk about how we do that, whether it's bringing inventory closer to you, building autonomous technologies. Those are all getting into the space of the how and the details. But I think there's a big kind of battle, if you will, of how do you actually facilitate all the atoms in the physical world in a way that actually, solves real problems for real consumers, and grows the GDP of the cities that house all of us. That's a big mission of where DoorDash is going.
Yeah, it's a compelling answer. As you were saying that, I was trying to do a mental checklist in my head about, okay, probably use 70 apps on my phone regularly. And I was like, okay, probably 60 of them are just bits flying around the internet. And maybe 10 of them interact with the real world. Maybe Amazon, Uber, DoorDash. And it's a pretty small list of apps that kind of like actually interact with the physical world that have a digital interface. And this is interesting because you have clearly created a company that believes it can tackle that divide, right? So, and there are very few companies in America that I think have that belief relative to, say, if you go to Bangalore, so SCC has a place in Bangalore, you see entrepreneurs there and they see logistical operational challenges and it's like they have it for breakfast. It's not a big deal.
Totally.
Right? And so it's kind of always remarkable to me that when you come to America, there's a real trepidation, fear, or maybe almost lack of know-how. How did you build that within the company?
Yeah, well, we didn't have any of it either to get started. I mean, but I guess the short answer of how any of you guys are probably building your own companies is you start by doing the work yourself. For us, it was 4 of us who started the company. We just did deliveries every day. We did customer support every day. I still do customer support, about 15 minutes every day, and I still do deliveries every year. And that teaches you many things. That teaches you things that there's no way that if you're just staring at, I guess now if Claude is staring at, your databases to try to just come up with whatever the right algorithm is, it doesn't teach you that, oh, actually, if I try to assign the closest, driver to a restaurant, for an order, that may not be the best idea if the food's not ready. But you would know that almost immediately if you actually did deliveries yourself. And so there's no like secret sauce, I think, in any of the domains that each of you are pursuing. You have to be the expert, and you can be the expert, maybe not on day one, but if you did it every single day for, a decade, I think you'll be pretty close.
One of the things that is tricky about building for the real world is that, margins are thinner. And kind of like, sometimes when you talk to entrepreneurs who are kind of building in hardware or the real world, you realize what a great business model software is, right? Like if you have 75, 80% gross.
You have a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, exactly. So 75, 80% gross margins, you can f a lot of shit up and still your business will be alive generally, right? It's much harder with like kind of like real world businesses. So I guess how do you balance in some ways, how do you create a system within these companies that allows you to move fast while also realizing there is a cost to actually like making mistakes that is much larger than your average software company. And obviously, there's a very famous example that you've talked about the Stanford football game, I think. But how do you not let that experience intrinsically just slow you down? So how have you found that balance at DoorDash?
Yeah. I think that, this is probably, the answer that would be true, honestly, in building great software too, which is if you care a lot about crafts, you should care a lot about efficiency. And I would argue every craft, every function has some efficient frontier. There's always some version of the optimization where you're trying to maximize quality subject to some constraint. The constraint could be time, it could be budget, it could be something else, but every function has that. And I think everyone who I've always admired, in terms of their pursuit of their craft excellence, always gets that. So there's no one thing, Aditya, to answer your question, but it's almost like every project, if you think about, the unit of work at any company, including your own, probably boils down to some project. That project boils down to some set of workflows. And for each one of those projects and workflows, there is probably this efficient frontier. I think even the fact that you institute that and then measure it and then hold people accountable to it, that ultimately becomes a system that, reinforces in real practice, not just culturally, but actually operationally, how you actually build a system that cares about quality and cares about efficiency.
Moving on to perhaps just kind of tackling obviously what everyone here is working on directly, indirectly, obviously, various parts of the AI stack.
Sure.
Maybe to think first about AI at the application layer.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the tricky parts is that it's weird, right? You would think that we would have moved on from a basic kind of text IRC interface to AI, which kind of, came about in November 2022 with ChatGPT. But it's actually if you use Claude Code in terminal mode, it's literally exactly that right now. So I guess what I'm trying to, do you have thoughts on how does this UI evolve? Because I don't actually think we know yet as an industry. Voice mode, text mode, they all seem quite basic. So I'm wondering if you are seeing something within DoorDash that you might have an idea to share.
I definitely agree with you that we're all trying to figure it out, and that everyone knows that, whatever we have today is probably the worst version of what we're going to have in the future, right? And so I think in some ways that's, hopefully should bring a sense of optimism. I mean, these tools have already brought tremendous productivity gains and, frankly, ideas, new ideas, etc. I think the thing that sometimes gets missed, though, in the search, if you will, for some of these, and I think this will be the answer, or at least the approach that we're thinking about at DoorDash, is you got to figure out what the end-to-end job ultimately for the customer is. And I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of, what that is. For DoorDash, the end-to-end job is to bring you something, whether it's a t-shirt, a water bottle, a hamburger, whatever it might be. And our job's not finished until that whole sentence gets completed. Some of that happens in a digital interface. Some of that can happen through, photos and video, maybe voice, maybe search, maybe an assistant that does a complicated query for you. But some of it has to get finished ultimately offline and physically. Actually, many things have to happen offline physically in order for that one sentence to be completed. And I think that's why it's hard. It's because the end-to-end job, for any user, depending on what the job is, may actually require a different interface. And I think that's what we're all trying to figure out. We're kind of solving for different use cases here, different use cases there. On the flip side, a lot has already taken off on just some of these chat interfaces. I mean, the usage, I think, speaks just by probably the usage in this room. And so that's where we're at right now. And I think, the main, at least advice I give our teams is, what's the ultimate end-to-end job? And then from there, let's figure out what the interfaces ought to be. And I think right now, I think every company is in some exploration of that.
As a prominent company that is obviously integrating AI, how do you make sense of the model landscape? Are you just happy that there are multiple model providers? that are kind of like essentially trying to win your business? Do you also feel as though that you need to be moving down the stack yourself to own more components around the context, the memory, the long horizon planning? Like, what is your kind of like chess play there?
It goes back to a bit the previous question, where I think the name of the game is to understand what is it that we're actually doing for the customer. Instead of starting from what is the thing I must protect for my business. It's almost like if you can run your business with metrics that only a customer would care about. For example, a customer doesn't care about how many users you have or how much revenue you generate or whatever your ARR is or your weekly growth rate. I actually think that will give better insight as to potentially, what to actually work on in terms of, producing a roadmap. And so, for us, the first thing is you got to play with all the tools and understand what are the actual true capabilities versus what their promise is. And I would argue, that's different by different types of areas. In coding, like you were saying, Aditya, like I totally agree. I think the progress of reality versus promise, that is getting very quickly closed. In some other areas where you're trying to solve an end-to-end workflow that may have multiple systems that need to be touched, that requires human judgment, that does not have a verifiable good response, that's not a great place right now, in terms of, for AI agents, where the gap between reality and the future potential is still fairly sizable, I think. At least the way that we've thought about it is, how are we going to make the most sense of what the end-to-end job is? How do we make the most sense of what are the tools today? What can they be used for? And then how do we actually, marry those two things to deliver something unique? It's not, it's not rocket science, to answer your question. It's also not starting though from a place of, okay, here is the, big strategy, and therefore these are the things that we must own. Because I think candidly, I would say that the field is moving so quickly that it's very, very hard to know exactly, certainly within the next 5 years, where the technology is going to go and how far in terms of what it can do will be.
Yeah, I mean, I love that answer, particularly the part about everybody should just be using these technologies.
Yeah.
And I often am just like, you kind of, there's still a little bit of an inertia where you go in and you're like, I'm going to have to learn how to use this thing. I'm going to suck at it in the beginning. But these tools are just like, honestly, all of us are capable of using these tools.
100%.
By the way, one of the notes I have here is that Tony is customer obsessed, not competitor focused. And it's pretty amazing. You've kind of brought up like having a customer centric point of view multiple times. And it's clear that that's how you kind of like frame a lot of your kind of thinking about both what to build and what DoorDash should be doing. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. Generally, when there are these huge platform shifts, is when both, old and new incumbents tend to get displaced, right? Or at least they're under the most threat, right? So do you worry that there is a more AI native version of DoorDash out there? And if so, like, what would that look like? You don't have to give out the ideas, but like, I'm curious, like, what is a more AI native version of kind of an interface to the physical world? What would that look like?
I always go back to what is the end-to-end problem that we're trying to solve, and what are the different component parts, right? One of the challenges we found in building DoorDash is it's not just an app. It's not just a logistics algorithm. It's not just, a lot of customer service issues that we have to resolve within usually seconds or minutes. It's all of these things coordinated together in order to, just do something simple, like bring you lunch or bring you dinner. And, the question I always ask is, where can a new technology, to your point, and it doesn't have to be, AI, even though I'm sure that's getting more than 100% of the airtime these days, whether it's autonomous technologies, things that are physical like hardware. But regardless of the technology, regardless of like the specific implementation details, like what is this thing actually capable of in terms of which part of the stack can it actually do better? Because in truth, like I don't view any digital solution that's going to, replace an end-to-end system that has physical parts if it can't also do the physical part, right? But maybe there's parts of the digital experience in which it can. Certainly, for instance, you can write much better queries on chat assistants with greater intelligence that right now the DoorDash app can't do. Okay, that might be an area in which we look into, right? But that alone would be insufficient to actually bring the customer what they want, which is maybe lunch or dinner, or the latest pair of shoes, or I don't know, lipstick that they forgot because they're on a work trip or something like that. And you kind of have to do all of those things. And so the way I think about it is like, well, where are we most vulnerable? Or where do we have the most opportunities? The same version of the same question, the other side of the question, where it's actually going to help. Again, if I looked at every metric at the company from a customer's perspective, not whatever the output metrics might be in terms of what we report to Wall Street, well, very quickly, you're going to know, I think, and then I'll just evaluate the new technology against each one of these areas to see where it can do better. If it can do better, we're going to be the fastest or the greatest adopter of that tool.
Are you doing anything interesting in terms of accumulating kind of a data moat that, perhaps in the coming 2-3 years would allow you to essentially build your own kind of like RL models, or your own, whatever the version is of kind of doing post-training, kind of whatever the current regime is, kind of like in 3 or 4 years. Are you doing anything special in terms of readying yourself for that?
Yeah, so one of the things, if you think about what we've had to do in terms of building DoorDash, is we basically have to digitize the physical world. And I think while, LLMs can obviously train on all of the internet, if the data is not available on the internet, that would be very difficult to perform that task. Data such as, where can we find the last parking space near this building in San Francisco? Data such as, how many Coke cans are available to buy at the Safeway on 4th Street nearby here? Or where can I find the cheapest pair of shoes in size 10.5, for my upcoming, 5K race this weekend? Well, those answers don't exist on the internet because those answers don't even exist sometimes in the physical world in a digitized format. And so if you think back about what one of the things that DoorDash is building, we're building lots of inventory systems effectively, where we're trying to catalog information for the first time that's never been available on the internet. This is why we have to use our own sometimes mapping systems, our own inventory systems. It's not because we don't trust third-party systems. It's because third-party systems either don't exist or the information is very incomplete. And so for us, that information can be very useful. And in the way I always think about how you build, technology is, how do you actually grow the pie so that you can get more participants into the ecosystem? And, this is a perfect example where we're building lots of this information, and we probably will be a very large, partner or participant where we will team up with some of these companies building these foundational models to actually build very useful models of information that doesn't exist, that it would be impossible to train on because they don't have it.
Yeah. No, that's actually a huge, both a huge asset and an opportunity. Yeah, that's amazing. What agents are you personally using? Yeah. In a personal or professional capacity?
I play with pretty much all of them. Okay. I literally personally play with all of them. Currently I've been very impressed with what Gemini has shipped.
Oh, it's amazing.
And you asked earlier, I think, a question about why do we not yet have the right set of interfaces? Why are we still stuck with text? Well, I think part of it is because I think some of these companies are trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? Like, for instance, if I'm doing a set of queries where I'm trying to learn about my health, as an example, where I may want to input a lot of, images that are held in arcane systems like an MRI or, an X-ray or, a blood test, or, these are in a lot of different systems that it has to pull from. And then there's obviously the consumer privacy component to that, which, adds a layer of complexity specifically in healthcare. But I could give the same kind of, example if we talked about what if you wanted to buy a house, Or what if you wanted to, think about investing for the first time? Or I'm a parent, I get a lot of parenting advice for some of these assistants. And sometimes you do want to, input like screaming audio from a child or a toddler, and the point that I'm trying to make is, each one of these tasks actually require a pretty different interface to offer a best-in-class experience versus what's provided today. And look, I think these providers know that, and they're working towards it. But those are some of my use cases, and I would say that those are some of the things I've experienced while using them.
Definitely have it's been a pretty good aid to help me raise my 3 children. Absolutely. Maybe to move on to how, instead of focusing just on AI, but kind of his company building beliefs, what's maybe one cultural aspect of DoorDash that both was present from the super early days and kind of continues to be a North Star today? Obviously, we have talked about customer obsession. Are there one or two other ones that are really, I would say, foundational to the company DNA?
DoorDash sits at this like intersection, if you will, of almost like physical operations that have to happen, and you have to build technology to scale it. Otherwise, there's no way you can do billions of these, transactions. And both sentences are correct. And, one of the things that we've learned early on is that it is very hard to sit at your desk or have 2 really smart people argue with the most compelling data, 2 opposing points of view on how to solve one problem. The best way to actually collect information or action is by shipping something. There's this value at DoorDash called bias for action, where, the way we settle debates is we ship something. It doesn't mean it's the correct thing. Almost always it's a hacked together prototype, maybe not even a prototype. Maybe it's, just calling up a customer and trying something with them that ultimately gets us more information. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that it's a perfectly statistically, strong answer. But that's been something that, I've always been very proud of at DoorDash, where even to this day, we try our best to answer questions through shipping things versus who writes the best document, who articulates their point of view the best in a meeting, whose title, is the most senior, things like that. Another one that comes to mind from the very earliest days, you referenced that Stanford football example where we were late on every order and we ultimately refund all the customers, is there's this notion of, there's a saying internally at the company where we say one team, one fight, where we don't care that much about what your job description or your function that you were recruited into, says about what your job should be. Your job is to help the customer win. That's your job. If that means you should be doing deliveries or doing customer support, regardless if you're an engineer or whatever you might be, recruited into the company doing, that's what you ultimately do. And I think it goes back to pointing out that many different teams are required to solve one very simple problem. Even though the customer might be just bringing you, I don't know, your groceries or something, many teams, not just the technical teams, were responsible for that one order. And it promotes not only this understanding that, there's an end-to-end workflow that is really important to understand every single component part. It actually promotes a culture where there's very high accountability, but low blame, especially when things go wrong. And, that's something that's very important to keep, whether you're 4 people in my apartment when we started the company, or you're now 10,000 people plus.
Is there anything that you've had to consciously almost like affect a change in? Like there was something that perhaps worked for the company in the early days, but as the company grew, like actually turns out that in order to have a long-term company, this one thing that we all believed in, it's either, you kind of had to change your mind on, you had to update your priors on.
Every year we ask ourselves the question, what would we do differently if we started the company from scratch today? So DoorDash is heading into its 13th year. So we've thought about this about a dozen times at this point. And the short answer to your question, Aditya, is almost every part of the company, there's something we would do differently, right? And just by asking the question, you're probably going to come up with some set of answers. One of the things I love doing is really going to, the edges of distributions to study like what's interesting. For example, I care a lot about what new people say, new users say about our experience. I sometimes will delete my own account. and try signing up for the new user flow and see if it's as easy to use as it once was, many years ago. I care a lot about what new teammates say about working at the company. I care a lot also about the opposite end of the spectrum, the power users. The best notes I get are actually from Dashers. These are the drivers on our platform that would write me 1,000-word plus emails about things that they've observed. And they have tens of thousands of delivery data points that kind of are really compelling. And I learn, a tremendous amount from. And those always update my priors. So I don't think there's one meta point or belief that I've changed, because in part, I think part of what you're trying to do as the builder is you're constantly trying to update your priors. You're just trying to do a better job, today than you did yesterday and tomorrow versus today. That you should be trying to do that in every part of your company. Why wouldn't you? And so if somebody in the company had a better idea for how to do something, I am always all ears.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting cohort. If you think about the set of people who have done the top 1% of all kind of DoorDash deliveries and the amount that they know about kind of the implicit knowledge they might have about our logistics networks, our traffic networks, that's a pretty interesting data set.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Tony, you talk to a lot of CEOs, right? Like you're on Meta's board now as well. You've been there for 3 years or something. Have you found that you believe certain things about company building that are just kind of weird that no other CEO tends to believe?
Then no other CEO.
Do you have any heretical weird ideas about company building that seem to be a little bit outside of the standard? It's 2 standard deviations away, even in weird Silicon Valley.
Well, one of the things that I don't know if this is popular in Silicon Valley or not is that I think companies, and Meta is a great example, there are many others I can give you, that those companies don't get enough credit for building the core business, which allows them to invent the future and invest aggressively into building the future. I think a lot of attention, right? Think about what you read about or what is written about, is always about some shiny object and, kind of the twists and the turns and the ups and the downs. And trust me, there always will be those situations. But what I think is really interesting that maybe doesn't get as much attention or certainly as much praise is the constant grind of trying to improve a core business. I mean, if you think about the core businesses of Meta or any of the large tech companies, they've actually changed a lot since inception. I mean, you worked on some of them, so you definitely know. I think the constant work to make those businesses better, they don't just become better, by the way. The natural state of technology is that it decays. And so in order for you to attract that new user, you better work on the next thing, even if it's your old thing. And that's not sexy, and it's never interesting to cover those things. But I think one of the things I've learned about how you build really large, successful companies like the one that you've worked for is you have to build the core and you have to build the new. It can't just always be about the shiny objects, and you have to have, almost value systems and systems of almost appreciation, as well as, and I don't mean in words, but in expressed action internally inside the company to actually make it equally valuable to work on the core and to work on the new. I think that's very hard to do. I think you have to always do that because you're constantly updating your priors. We live in the world of technology where, the constant is always going to be change, more competition, and faster iteration. But you almost have to, remember that you have to keep working on the thing that got you there too. And you have to keep doing that over and again, because one day the shiny object you're working on today is going to be the old project someday, if you're successful. And you have to kind of keep rinsing and repeating.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think that Silicon Valley is so predicated on the new, the shiny.
Of course.
But man, if you grow at 30% year over year for 20 years, right, that's kind of like a generational business,
And it's hard to do. And it doesn't just happen on its own. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. And that I think a lot of times in Silicon Valley, what we talk about is we talk about the paradigm shift. And trust me, those are ones you got to get right, of course. And they deserve all the attention. But you also have to get right all the thousands of small things that add up to what are monumental changes on some of these businesses that are huge scale, touching billions of people every single day, and still trying to grow 30% a year. It doesn't just happen on its own.
So, I mean, I'm curious, how are you trying to do that at DoorDash? Because that's tricky, right? Because like, how do you institute and how do you capture the importance of that without making it feel, frankly, overly grindy?
Yeah.
You know, like, and it's just about the numbers where all we're looking at is just like, how do you make it both fun, but also kind of, the requisite amount of importance? Yeah.
I think you can always make something better. I think I start with that belief. One test I always would do with DoorDash is I would say, okay, a lot of us live in city centers, like San Francisco or New York or some of these places. Just drive 15 minutes in every direction and use the product again. Okay, drive another 15 minutes. You don't have to drive that many, incremental minutes traveled before you start realizing that the product gets weaker and weaker. And the interesting question is, well, why? One of the hard things about what DoorDash builds is that it's not this global service that kind of is, relatively speaking, the same product, every time we serve it on a compute instance or something like that. There's differences, like the town, not the city, the town I grew up in, had very few restaurants, 24 restaurants total. That's very different from San Francisco. What you can offer in that town versus what you can offer in San Francisco are materially different. But as consumers, you kind of only think about your own experience. You don't think about, we're completely like, myopic in our view of, what the actual experience is. And so I think, to keep things fresh, to answer your question, Aditya, is you got to actually, you find ways to articulate the customer struggle in a very visceral way. And, I gave one small example of how we've done it at the company, but there's a lot of ways. It's why we do deliveries. Why do we do deliveries? Okay, we have, everyone do deliveries 4 times a year. You're going to find out maybe in 3 of those 4 times that there's something broken. It may not be this earth-shattering discovery, but when you add all of them up across, 10,000 people, it starts to add up. And if you did that every single time, it starts to compound. And I would argue that, that is a lot of how innovation happens in the physical world. It's not like, it doesn't have to be an earth-shattering thing. And you want to self-select. You want to find people who enjoy those kinds of problems versus people who only want to work on the new.
I'm curious, we are all, maybe to move on to some of your own, how do you stay curious? How do you stay motivated? Which is that, what's your information kind of like diet or regimen? It's so hard to keep up right now with all of both the pace of companies that are getting created, but then also the rate of kind of, I would say, development in a lot of these foundational technologies. So do you have any tips or tricks?
I think you can drive yourself crazy to try to keep up with everything right now. And I think I've always felt that way, though. At least for me personally, one of the things I have to do is, I don't know if this is a tip or a trick, it's almost a survival mechanism, is to remind myself of what's important and what will always be important. And then to find things that kind of filter, if you will, into some of those statements versus, let me just see what's the latest X post or the latest, whatever, thing that you guys see in Hacker News or whatever that, some engineer decided to show me in terms of some cool new version of a tool that we haven't been using. I think that's very easy to just get drowned out by the inbound. And especially, you guys are, the number one thing that you're competing against as a startup founder is time. You're competing against time. And so you kind of have to always, write down the 1 or 2 things that you're trying to solve for at that exact moment to get you to product market fit or whatever the milestone you're still in search of is, and to just stay relentlessly focused. So to me, that's probably the only survival mechanism I use in terms of my information digest. Otherwise, I think I could spend 20 hours a day reading and get nothing done.
Yeah, so true. Before I open it up to the audience, one of the questions I love asking in this forum is, how do you think about preparing for preparing your children for what is bound to be a pretty different world even the next 5 or 7 years? And, we have kids that are about the same age, so it's something that I admit that it's kind of tricky right now. And, you want to give them access to obviously the new tools, let them experiment, have agency. But what advice would you give to, I bet there is a bunch of young parents in the room as well. So what advice, and older parents, what advice would you give them?
So I go back to, what I was saying earlier about the information digest. And one of my things that I always like to, write down is like, what do I think is going to remain important in the next, 5 years about, DoorDash or whatever it is. It could be about raising your kids or, because that's the thing that's not going to change, even though all the tools and all the education or the ways in which we teach kids and all the opportunities they're going to get in a way that you and I never had growing up are going to change. A few that come to mind for kids, one of them is, do you actually feel like you have agency over what you want to do? Or do you kind of feel like, life doesn't matter and it's just a set of circumstances, thrown your way and whatever happens, happens. Another one might be, what does the definition of excellence look like? Because excellence isn't just building the prototype, right? Excellence is taking it to the finished production line. And that gap might be very small in terms of progress bar, but it is massive in terms of getting all the rough edges right. And that might be true in programming. That might be true doing some other activity. And the third is, I'm still a big believer in humanity. I know that there's a huge debate right now about what is the future of, what humans will do versus what machines will do. But I think it's really important to be a good human, that I believe most humans were born that way, if not every human was born that way. And along the way, things change at times. And so those are probably 3 things that come to mind of like, what are the things that I think are going to remain to be important?
Yeah, no, I think particularly that last one about, I think in some ways reveling in our shared humanity, I think is like really important to not lose sight of. I've been thinking a lot about the agency one myself, which is that it's weird because with the advent of these LLMs, it's such a fine line, because even as an individual, I find myself sometimes getting lazier because I'm just like, it's like this, like let the thing do it. Whereas the right answer is like, oh, I can do anything.
Yeah.
Like you wake up, you're like, I can do so much more. I'm limited by my own creativity, my desire, my energy. But it's a fine line like that I feel personally. So I think that how do I get my children, my coworkers, people I care about to kind of like be on the right side of that? It's tricky. Yeah. Okay, questions. We'll go with Ambrish. Why don't we go?
Awesome. Thank you for the wonderful chat. I think we talked a lot about change and how we're adapting. One of the things I want to ask, you kind of answered that on the personal front, but if you look at DoorDash in 13 plus years, what has not changed? What has been the invariant? And is that a framework you also use sometimes to make those decisions when you're prioritizing? Any kind of stories or anything about how you think about constant invariant thing in customers?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that, whenever I evaluate like a new way of doing something, whether it's an AI agent, some other new technology, is, well, I know that customers are still going to want more things delivered, not fewer things delivered more cheaply, not more expensive. They're going to want it probably faster, not slower. And they're going to want better customer support, not worse. And if that is true, how does this technology help? Why is it better? Is it just better because everyone else is using it? Is it better because it actually truly does something in a better way? This is what I mean by having a strong point of view of from the customer's perspective, not necessarily from the company's perspective, because there's lots of things that may benefit a company that may not benefit a customer. Either it's orthogonal or it may be at odds. And That's usually the place I would start. And you can ask that same question about new ways of doing things. I ask new teammates all the time, like, how would you do this better? I'm sure there are lots of observations of how we do things poorly. But then, in terms of the response, the eval, if you will, is that verifiable set of responses of what does not change.
Thank you, Tony and Aditya, for the talk. Earlier, you mentioned that there can be a lot of noise online, and like, how would you recommend founders balance the heads down building kind of mindset with worrying about competitors or like news or the cutting edge?
Yeah, I think it's very hard because at the end of the day, we're all humans, and humans are very susceptible to a lot of human nature. And then, fighting human nature is probably the hardest thing that you'll ever do as a founder, or you'll always do as a founder if you choose to be so lucky to keep going at it. And I would say your job is just to find product market fit. That really is the name of the game for you. And, being maniacally obsessed over that, I think will be, candidly, not just the survival mechanism, but also maybe like what should guide all of the roadmap. Because I think it's really easy to be caught up in, everything else that comes with being a startup founder. There's more resources. There's, like you said, probably more competitors because of the greater resources. There's certainly obviously changes in technology. But at the end of the day, I think if you just keep asking yourself, like, what is the most important thing on your eval today for the company in terms of company success? If you found product market fit, it's going to be something else. But until you found it, that's probably going to be the thing. And you have to define that ideally into a set of concrete things that your teams can work on to knowing, because you're not going to just hit product market fit and then you just know it. It probably will be one of these things that's a bit of a non-linear process.
I believe that a lot of founders kind of share common traits around being obsessive, around being competitive, around kind of like having a certain amount of almost like paranoia, competitiveness, kind of like, energy. Find other things that can help you channel that, right? Like, I personally love taking on some kind of stupid physical challenge every year that I can then systematically, and it's just like a way of like channeling that just, competitiveness, that aggression, that kind of like desire to improve. And I think that just is net better because I want to stay physically fit for like the long-term arc of being a founder. So I think it's just too easy to spend all of your time online. I think it's kind of the lowest common denominator. Yeah.
Hey, Tony, welcome to SPC. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
A question for you. Delivery, food delivery seems like such an obvious thing today, obviously, but looking back through your journey, was there a moment, or what was your non-consensus insight that you had as a founder when you're talking to people about your idea or scaling? Like, was there a lot of no's? Was there any non-consensus insight that you came across or had?
Yeah, well, I mean, for about 3 years, it was that we believed we ought to exist and that you could build a business out of it. That was the non-consensus insight where, for about 3 years, I couldn't raise a dime of capital. And, we almost ran out of cash many times during that period. And, we probably lost about maybe 20 to 25% of the team because, I'm every week at an all hands like this showing the cash balance going towards zero. DoorDash is a very intellectually honest place. I'm very proud of that. And there's very talented people. And I said, look, if you want to polish your resume, I would get it. For a long period of time, I would say for the first half, if you will, DoorDash is 13 years old, but for the first half, I would say DoorDash was a very non-consensus bet. And, there was there's 3 years what I personally remember getting rejected by over 100 investors. Yeah, it was non-consensus that you can actually build a system where you're trying to deliver something quite perishable. You have to coordinate 3 parties on every single order just to make one order and then somehow make the math work. There were many things to believe in order to actually believe that there was a path forward. But, the best way to tell as a founder of whether or not you're sitting on that border of delusion and ambition is whether or not your customers actually want what you're doing. And, and so I think the reason why you may ask, I think an interesting question could be, well, why did 75 to 80% of people stay? You said 20 to 25% of people left. Yeah, that's true, but the majority stayed by math. And the reason, I think, isn't just because of a belief that a company like DoorDash, where you're trying to grow local businesses and grow their connections with local consumers, that's worthwhile, but that, well, the metrics were actually indicating that we were onto something and that it wasn't just this mission that is worth fighting for, right? And what they saw was they're like, wow, okay, so we actually have better retention and usage than anyone else. We have improving unit economics, and that if you do enough volume, that the math is going to work. Some version, I mean, that's an overly simplified version of the narrative, but we had a lot of doubters and a lot of days in which we had to endure through, this wandering desert in order to make it to the other side.
It's interesting. Back even in like 2018, I would say, it wasn't all like it wasn't like, oh, I want to buy good stuff from a San Francisco restaurant. It'd be like, oh, does Grubhub actually work? Like, does Uber? And then now it's kind of amazing. It always works. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Thank you, Tony, for taking the time. This was a pleasure. I think that the amount of joy that you have probably delivered to a bunch of people in this room through the products you have built, I think is incredible. So thank you for everything that you do and your team does. And we hope to have you back here in the future. Awesome. Thank you.